we've all figured out, I heard the conversation, you're wired right now.
Oh, boy, Jill's wearing a wire.
You
know what?
You know, you sort of
Try and really cover it.
You've sort of been in this neighborhood. Tell us about it.
I've been, roaming around these folks for a while. Look, George Papadopoulos is somebody who showed up on this list of foreign policy advisors, and there's a lot of revisionist history going on about how that list ended up in Trump's hands, why he read it off at the Washington Post meeting. Remember, this was a point in the campaign where he was under a lot of pressure to say he had advisors on policy. So the fact that he read this off, at the time was looked at as something that was just maybe a list that was handed to him. But look, I've talked to George, other people have talked to George, in part because the other person who was on that list who's gotten so much attention is Carter Page.
Right.
And a lot of folks said that while Carter was not in the room with the president, while he was not around much, that George was around, at least, if not around the president all the time. There was a policy shop that was being operated out of the campaign headquarters in Virginia, and that he was certainly there and involved in discussions.
So fair to say then, Julie, in your experience reporting this, that George Papadopoulos was not just some volunteer on the campaign, not somebody that didn't have influence?
I wouldn't call him a major player on the campaign, but you have to remember, there was the campaign headquarters where you had Paul Manafort, where you had Corey Lewandowski, and you had Donald Trump and the family, but you did have this policy shop that was operating out of Virginia that ostensibly was trying to create policy for this campaign.
But was he banking yard signs and putting bumper stickers out, or was he doing Russia policy? I mean, which one?
Well, we never really got clarity on specifically what he or the others actually produced, but they were there operating.
How does he get to the campaign? Who gets him into the campaign?
So this is another one of these sort of mysteries that no one wants to really take ownership for. So there are a couple of other officials who factor into the decision making about who got onto these lists. One is Sam Clovis, who's now an official at the Department of Agriculture. Another is Barry Bennett, who was with the campaign, then off the campaign. But these were sort of the senior folks that were in that Virginia office.
And Carol, you've spent an awful lot of time, obviously, reporting on Paul Manafort. What can you tell us?
Well, it's pretty amazing to think that the chairman of a campaign somehow is accused now of laundering 12 to 13 to 18 million dollars in money he didn't report, in alleged tax evasion, creating 17 different accounts or in different places to bank money that he didn't share with the Justice Department or with the IRS. It's a striking document, this unsealed indictment.
All right, let's bring in law professor at George Washington University, Jonathan Turley, and former U.S. Attorney Joyce Vance. Good to have you both on board this morning.
So, Joyce, looking at everything that came down yesterday from Bob Mueller's office, what's your impression?
My impression is that Mueller has launched the opening salvo in what's going to be a long but very successful war. It's an impressive indictment, this charging document against Manafort and Gates. It's rich in detail. They've obviously followed the money, and they've put that paper trail into the indictment. Many of these charges are almost self-proving in the sense that it's the failure to file, which cannot be contested, that leads to criminal liability. And then the 1-2 punch following the Manafort and Gates indictment with this tremendous news that there's a guilty plea and a proactive cooperator in George Papadopoulos sends a strong message that Mueller isn't playing around, that this investigation will reach the White House lawn and perhaps the Oval Office. It was a tremendous day for Bob Mueller.
And was there any foreshadowing in what you read yesterday that suggests where Bob Mueller is going next or where his ultimate destination is?
So I think at dinner tables last night and perhaps in lawyers' offices this morning, anyone who had involvement in this entire scheme, whether they were high or low in knowledge, is talking about whether they now need to go ahead and volunteer what they know to prosecutors. Do they need to be first in and cut some sort of a deal to save themselves before others do that? Mueller's next steps, I think, will depend on what he hears. And frankly, it's unlikely that Papadopoulos was the only cooperator. I think that there may be many other folks who've been wearing wires and making phone calls these last few months.
Joyce, if Paul Manafort went to trial, if he were to be found guilty on charges of money laundering, tax evasion from a foreign government, the Ukraine or wherever, what would be the sentencing recommendation?
So federal sentencing is a little bit complicated. You see a number in the statute. So we're hearing 20 years on the money laundering charges. Actually, it's not quite that high. There's a guideline calculation that's prepared for a federal judge at sentencing. It's based on the defendant's prior criminal history and his conduct in the case he's being charged in. And in financial crimes, that sentence is very strongly driven by the dollar amount involved. Here, the dollar amounts are astronomical. Manafort is probably looking at something in a range of 152 months, and prosecutors could ask the judge to depart upwards to enhance that sentence and make it longer because his conduct was so incredibly harmful to the interests of this country.
So, Jonathan Turley, we focused on Paul Manafort because he is such a well-known figure in all of this, and we've watched him throughout the campaign last year and into this year. But there's another name on that indictment, Rick Gates, who you believe could be even more significant, at least on these charges, than Paul Manafort.
I do. You know, the problem, many people have been talking about whether Manafort himself could flip. That's unlikely because he's the matinee defendant. You know, that's a bad position to be in. He is the prize right now. So to get this type of plea, you got to bring some deliverables. You have to show that you can implicate somebody much higher. If you're the matinee defendant, that's got to be another matinee target. And it's not clear that Manafort has that type of information. Gates is different. I mean, he's not what you would call the lowest hanging fruit. But he's in a position that if he can supply deliverables against Manafort or people above Manafort, he honestly could avoid jail time or have very little jail time. So he's the one to watch, and so is General Flynn. The fact that we have not heard anything about General Flynn is very surprising. You know, those FAIR accounts in the complaint, as you know, there's only been about 7 prosecutions. And so this is a weird mix, very serious allegations in these violations. Then you got these FAIR accounts. That really sends a message to people like Flynn, potentially Tony Podesta and others, that we just nailed a guy for this. I mean, you could white out Manafort's name and put a couple of names in those graphs and they would read just fine.
Yeah, Jeremy, you look at Gates, and he's a guy that not only was there during the campaign, but even after Manafort left, he was still there, worked towards the end of the campaign, worked on the inaugural committee, worked as a liaison, I believe, to the RNC, and was about to start helping Trump's outside super PAC. So this guy has been there for a long, long time, has a lot to tell.
Yeah, he has every incentive to cooperate right now. He's got information not just about the effort by Russian-backed Ukrainian entities to influence Washington, the money laundering, the tax evasion, but he potentially has information about the campaign, and he also has information about the Trump administration.
So, Julie, we're coming up almost on 24 hours since we've heard from the President of the United States, which is a rare thing these days. How concerned is the White House, as you report yesterday, and what are they most worried about?
So they're definitely concerned. You're seeing a lot of public brushing off of what happened yesterday, but certainly there's a high level of concern, not only because of what we actually saw with these 3 people, but because we're in a phase of the Mueller investigation where you have former White House officials and current White House officials who are going before Mueller. And the message that Mueller sent is that he's taking things like lying to him and to his prosecutors as a really serious offense. It sends, I think, it could have a chilling effect on people who are currently in this White House.
So, do you have any sense within the White House staff how many have retained lawyers?
Several have, for sure. Certainly the people who have left, Sean Spicer, Reince Priebus. We know Hope Hicks, who's a close confidant of the president, has retained counsel. Obviously, we know that Jared Kushner has retained counsel.
Don McGahn.
Don McGahn has counsel. So it's pretty widespread within the West Wing right now.
And then the question is, you know, who was wired and who might just turn themselves in right now and get a deal to save themselves? This is like, at this point, every man for himself or woman.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.